As Indo-European studies developed through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, there was a shift in modern Indo-European studies from linguistics to asking who were the people who spoke this ancient language and where did they come from? It is the latter question we are primarily concerned with in this video, a question that scholars have debated since the 17th century. Sir William Jones placed it in Iran. The Hindu Kush or the Himalayas were also popular choices in the early 19th century due to a desire to insulate the Indo-European homeland by large natural barriers. Here, primitive Aryans were believed to have perfected their language before spreading over the rest of Eurasia. Most initial efforts to answer the homeland problem constituted a linguistic analysis which involved identifying reconstructed ecological Proto-Indo-European terms which could be confined to a general area. This is known as linguistic paleontology, which is a recurrently utilized method in the search for the PIE homeland. Early serious attempts to locate the PIE Urheimat included Victor Haens' Kulturpflanzen und Haustiere in ihrem Übergang aus Asien nach Griechenland und Italien sowie in das übrige Europa and Otto Schrader's Reallexikon der indogermanischen Altertumskunde, who both used linguistic paleontology but arrived at different conclusions, with the former proposing an Asian homeland and the latter proposing a southern Russian homeland that would form the first steps of the later Steppe theory. Hypotheses were often dropped in favour of new ones by the same academics, such as A.H. Sayce, giving the following three statements over his career. 1880, this Aryan family of speech was of Asiatic origin. 1890, this Aryan family of speech was of European origin. 1927, so far as my examination of the facts has gone, it has led me to the conviction that it was in Asia Minor that the Indo-European languages developed. Early efforts to find the PIE homeland were in part fueled by the rise of nationalism, with many of these nationalists trying to look for a pure national heritage. This included the concept of the Nordic race, which nationalists began to associate with ancient, powerful, blue-eyed and light-skinned warriors mentioned in classical Greco-Roman texts when describing the Scythians and the Germanic tribes. The discovery of PIE led to their mystical speakers being associated with this Nordic race without further reflection. In the context of the search for the PIE Urheimat, the popularization of these ideas in places like Germany in the 30s and 40s simultaneously propelled the theories of the likes of Otto Reche and Karl Penka, who placed the Urheimat firmly in northern Europe. This included the popular misappropriation of the Indo-Iranian ethnonym Aryan from Sanskrit and Avestan texts, which should only be confined to speakers of that particular branch. In addition to Reche and Penka was Gustav Kossinna, who illustrated the outward migrations of the supposed Aryans from northern Europe. Utilizing linguistic paleontology, it was hypothesized that since the term for salmon in Germanic, Baltic and Slavic languages all descended from the PIE root lux, the homeland must be centered around that area, that is, broadly northern Europe. This argument collapsed over time as linguists reconstructed lux to not specify salmon, but trout-like fish, species of which are present in many parts of Eurasia. The beech tree, or bargo, was used as another piece of evidence, and the argument was that as the copper beech did not grow east of Poland, this supported an Urheimat in northern or even western Europe. However, descendants of this root are not found in many of the Asian branches, for example, Indo-Iranian, Anatolian or Tocharian. It was noted that the root could also be referring to other trees in different branches, for example, pagos in Proto-Hellenic, which may mean oak tree. The common beech also grows in the Caucasus, and so its actual original meaning is too unclear to constitute a solid argument for any Urheimat. Linguistic paleontology also helps us to eliminate some regions as possible Urheimats, such as the words for bee and honey, or medu, which has direct derivatives, and therefore solid reconstructions in many Indo-European languages. Honeybees did not natively exist east of the Urals, which eliminates all of Siberia and much of northeastern Eurasia as candidates, including the Central Asian steppes of Kazakhstan. The horse, or equo, is also solidly reconstructed and geographically excludes the Near East, Iran, and the Indian subcontinent due to horses being rare or non-existent there, compared to areas like the steppes west of the Urals, the Caucasus Mountains, and temperate parts of Europe and Anatolia. Now we are happy to announce the sponsor for this video, Private Internet Access, the world's most transparent VPN provider. Imagine the Indo-Europeans without the horse or the wheel. That is what browsing the internet without private internet access is like, being unable to explore the world beyond your borders. Take streaming services like Netflix, for example. Countless shows like Vikings are only available in certain regions, but with private internet access you can connect to servers in 91 countries, as well as all 50 US states, allowing you to finally be able to watch thousands of previously unavailable movies and shows. Private Internet Access's VPN uses its world-class server infrastructure to also protect your devices by hiding your IP address and encrypting your internet connection, therefore shielding your personal data from the likes of hackers, internet service providers, and government censors. Signing up with Private Internet Access is risk-free, with a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. Their no-logs policy, proven both in court and by external auditors, also ensures your data is never recorded or stored. Use the link piavpn.com/Indo in the description to get 83% off for just $2.03 a month, with an additional 4 months absolutely free. Now back to the video. In 1956, the Lithuanian archaeologist and anthropologist Marija Gimbutas, in The Prehistory of Eastern Europe, Part 1, outlined what became known as the Kurgan Hypothesis. The Kurgan culture seems the only remaining candidate for being Proto-Indo-European. There was no other culture in the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods which would correspond with the hypothetical mother culture of the Indo-Europeans, as reconstructed with the help of common words. Gimbutas chose the term Kurgan, which is Russian for barrow or mound, describing the unique burial traditions of certain cultures centered in the steppe that she used as the primary identifier of this common cultural continuum. Gimbutas called the Neolithic farming cultures of Europe Old Europe, who were Indo-Europeanized by the Kurgan people from the east, originating in the Volga-Ural region and arriving in 3 waves of movement between about 4000 to 2500 BCE. This process was viewed as a military victory that imposed their culture on the Old Europeans, especially in terms of societal structure, language and religion. The success of this transformation was attributed by Gimbutas to the contrast between the peaceful, matrilineal Old Europeans with the heavily militarized and mobile Kurgan people. The Kurgan culture was characterized by things like round burial mounds, that is kurgans, patriarchal and hierarchical societal structure, domestication of the horse and usage of horse-drawn wagons or carts, and a nomadic lifestyle. The evidence given for this hypothesis included a change in burial practices which was seen around southern Europe, with burial mounds identical to those on the steppe appearing, along with weapons and symbols of power, for example, horse-headed scepters. These graves were also mainly male, around 80%, and bore evidence of violent injuries, which was used to evidence the arrival of a patriarchal, warrior-led society. In the Danube region, there was evidence for the spread of the domestic horse from the steppe, including horse bones, cheek pieces, and the aforementioned horse-head scepters. In addition, fine ceramics had rapidly disintegrated, and painted wares had almost entirely disappeared. This is attributed to the Kurgan people, who seemed content to fashion crude, shell-tempered cooking vessels. Despite criticisms of Gimbutas's theory of mass invasions, it nonetheless laid the foundation for the steppe theory, which arose as the prevailing theory for the PIE Urheimat. In 1987, Colin Renfrew, in his book Archaeology and Language, The Puzzle of Indo-European Origins, argued that the speakers of PIE originated before 6000 BCE around eastern Anatolia. He criticized the use of linguistic paleontology and rejected Gimbutas's Kurgan model, viewing it as overly migration-heavy and outdated, as well as rejecting pottery-style changes as archaeological evidence of a replacement of old Europeans. He abandoned the image of warlike nomads spreading Indo-European by force in favour of a very gradual spread of Indo-European languages that accompanied the spread of farming. Renfrew's theory, although originally seen as a strong model, had largely been rejected over the years. Robert S.P. Beekes called the theory extremely improbable, stating that Renfrew's rejection of linguistic paleontology was, in light of his theory, being contradicted by the linguistic and historical data. Renfrew's slow movement of settlement by farmers also should have resulted in Indo-European languages containing a lot more loanwords, as well as more commonalities between branches that experienced a very gradual split. Beekes also found barely, if any, evidence that the Indo-Europeans brought agriculture to Europe. David W. Anthony echoed the critique of Renfrew's dismissal of linguistic paleontology, as well as echoing the latter point on agriculture, stating that agricultural vocabulary was borrowed into a later stage of PIE, likely from Afro-Asiatic languages. In 1989, J.P. Mallory, an American archaeologist, revised the original Kurgan Hypothesis in his work In Search of the Indo-Europeans, Language, Archaeology and Myth. He accepted the base of Gimbutas's Kurgan Hypothesis, but did not agree with the total military invasion scenario, and ultimately favoured a diffusion over an invasion. Mallory also presented various factors that may have contributed to the decline of the old Europeans, such as climate change, local societal evolution, intrusive steppe populations, or a combination of all three. In his own attempt to locate the PIE Urheimat, Mallory looked to languages at the time in Eurasia to see if they share any loanwords, rejecting the assumption that PIE was geographically isolated. Mallory found very little relationship between the pre-Indo-European languages of West and Southwest Europe, for example Basque, Iberian and Etruscan, and therefore saw little reason to look for a homeland in this region. Instead, Mallory found a much stronger link between Indo-European and the Uralic language family. Mallory stated that there is a convincing number of loanwords from Indo-European to Uralic at a very early stage, that is, at the proto-stages for both groups, and that therefore they can be seen as geographic neighbours, which helps to better place the Indo-European Urheimat. 13 words that are probable loans from PIE to Proto-Uralic were discussed by Jorma Koivulehto. Using Uralic to help find the Indo-European homeland is not as problematic as it sounds, as its proposed homeland is confined to a much smaller area than any supposed Indo-European homeland, and with a lot more certainty as to its location. David W. Anthony famously revised the steppe theory further in his work The Horse, the Wheel and Language. He identified the speakers of late PIE, that is, the ancestor of which existing branches branched off from and spread, with the wider Yamnaya horizon, and thus identified predating steppe cultures like Srednyi Sti with the original speakers of PIE, early Proto-Indo-European. Anthony described a horizon as a style or fashion in material culture that is rapidly accepted by and superimposed on local cultures across a wide area. He attributed the Yamnaya's spread of Indo-European languages to the mobility brought by wheeled vehicle technology and horseback riding, as well as the drying of the steppe, which motivated steppe peoples to take their herds further and further away from the riverbeds, out into the open grasslands. Anthony dated PIE to no earlier than 6,000 years ago, and separated it into stages of development. According to him, early PIE likely developed between 4,000 and 3,500 BCE on the Don-Volga-Ural region. Late PIE, which contained the full wagon vocabulary, expanded across the Pontic-Caspian steppe with the Yamnaya horizon from around 3,300 to 2,500 BCE, after which it had diverged into different branches. Anthony also included a linguistic period before early PIE called Archaic PIE, probably spoken before 4000 BCE, which is likely the period of PIE that Anatolian split from, before the Yamnaya even formed. The lack of wheeled vehicle vocabulary in Anatolian is explained by it likely splitting off before this technology appeared in the steppes. The focus of Anthony's work, therefore, was on the Yamnaya, even if they were not the earliest speakers of PIE associated by him with ancestral cultures like Srednyi, as they were responsible for the spread of the known branches of PIE, bar Anatolian, by way of their utilization of wheeled vehicles and horses to expand rapidly. Anthony conceded that the differences in Anatolian compared to late PIE and its branches indicate that it may in fact be a sister rather than daughter of PIE, resulting in a hypothetical language family originally coined Indo-Hittite, that is, the ancestor of both PIE and Proto-Anatolian, which we will refer to as Proto-Indo-Anatolian, PIA to avoid confusion. Anthony is open to different theories on their origin, but ultimately favoured a southwestern migration path by the Suvovodol-Novodanilovka complex, descendants of the Srednyi. He hypothesized that they made their way southwest through the Balkans, leading to the eventual separation of pre-Anatolian dialects from archaic PIE. Anthony saw Gimbutas's view of Old Europe as matrilineal and the Kurgan nomads being patriarchal and warlike as too black and white, and perhaps ideologically loaded. He echoed Mallory's combination of ecological and social factors, including small-scale steppe migrations that led to the decline of Old Europe. Anthony also criticized Gimbutas's migration depiction of waves of invasion or migration and prefers the term streams, that is, smaller and more targeted. Anthony, in explaining the language and cultural shifts in places where Proto-Indo-Europeans expanded, introduced the concept of elite recruitment. Ritual and political elites often introduce and popularize new ways of speaking. Small elite groups can encourage widespread language shift toward their language, even in tribal contexts in places where they succeed at introducing a new religion or political ideology or both, while taking control of key territories and trade commodities. Anthony hypothesized that the Indo-European languages spread in a similar way, by moving their herds to new pastures and using their ritual and political structures to gain control over these new lands and establish themselves as the elites, involving granting certain standings or statuses to neighbouring locals. These contractual relationships are known as patron-client relations. Anthony stated, "Archaeology reveals a set of cultures that fits all the requirements of the reconstructed vocabulary. They sacrificed domesticated horses, cattle and sheep, cultivated grain at least occasionally, drove wagons, and expressed institutionalized status distinctions in their funeral rituals. They occupied a part of the world, the steppes, where the sky is by far the most striking and magnificent part of the landscape, a fitting environment for people who believed that all of their most important deities lived in the sky." Archaeological evidence for migrations from this region into neighbouring regions, both to the west and to the east, is well established. The sequence and direction of these movements matches the sequence and direction suggested by Indo-European linguistics and geography. Anthony reiterated much of Mallory's linguistic neighbour analysis, stating that the linguistic relationship between PIE and Proto-Uralic suggests that PIE must have been spoken to the south and west of the Urals. In defending the steppe theory, Anthony wrote an article in 2024 titled 10 Constraints That Limit the Late PIE Homeland to the Steppes. We will focus on a couple of the key points here. Anthony stated that the presence of wheeled vehicle vocabulary in late PIE, that is, the stage of PIE spoken after Anatolian had branched off, limits the dating of when it was spoken to after the invention of wheels and axles, that is, after approximately 3500 BC, with the Yamnaya being the most notable and best-fitting steppe culture for this. Roots referring to wheels and wheeled vehicles, such as wagons, are seen across Indo-European branches, with common descent from PIE further proven by regular sound changes showing that they are not borrowed from elsewhere. Archaeological remains of over 300 wooden wheels and wheeled vehicles parts have been found in Yamnaya graves, radiocarbon dated to 3300 to 2600 BCE, which shows not only the spread of these innovations across the region, but also the incredible importance of these innovations in Yamnaya cultural beliefs. The appearance of the Dom-2 lineage, the ancestor of all modern domesticated horses, 95% of whose genetic pattern was present in select Yamnaya horses, appeared around 2200 BCE as a result of a four-phase process. Archaeological evidence of horse riding in skeletons, for example, horseman syndrome, which can exhibit changes to the pelvis, thighs, etc., is present in a pre-Yamnaya Kurgan, as well as Yamnaya individuals from Southeast Europe. However, in a 2021 paper by Librado et al., it was argued that the lack of steppe ancestry, in the form of Dom-2 clades in horses of the corded ware culture, which contrasted with the high steppe ancestry in corded ware people, meant that horse riding must have not played that large of a role in Yamnaya expansions. A 2023 paper by Meyer et al., however, arguably created a better model based on Librado et al.'s data, and concluded that as the sampled corded ware horses had 21% Dom-2 related ancestry, this did in fact suggest an important role for horse riding in Yamnaya expansions. Anthony stated that within 3500 and 2500 BCE, only the Yamnaya adopted a new technological invention, that of nomadic pastoralism. Innovative in both a technological and economic sense, this allowed for a huge increase in mobility, which allowed the Yamnaya to spread their genes and culture. This is due to the Yamnaya likely being the first to entirely commit to a mobile form of herding with ox-drawn wagons and herders on horseback. This in turn created a new mobile economy that provided a political networking advantage in an increasingly mobile and interconnected world. Two papers were published in 2015 that showed that the Yamnaya had contributed enormously to Eurasian genetics, one by Allentoft et al. And another by Haak et al. Haak et al.'s paper stated that there was a massive migration from the steppe into the heartland of Europe from its eastern periphery, through the discovery of persistent steppe ancestry, which is omnipresent in modern Europeans and supports the steppe hypothesis for the origin of some of the Indo-European languages of Europe at the very least. The graph shows the massive influx of Yamnaya DNA into Europe during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, which subsists to over 50% in some modern populations. The scale of the Yamnaya migrations, which Anthony grossly underestimated, ironically strengthened his hypothesis and vindicated Gimbutas in many ways. David Reich stated that before the explosion of ancient genetic data in 2015, any proposal that stated that the genetic changes associated with the spread of the Yamnaya could be as substantial as the archaeological changes would have been rejected. This even included Anthony himself, who instead proposed that the Yamnaya culture spread through imitation and proselytization in small-scale migrations. Early proponents of the hypothesis of an Armenian homeland for PIE used the same loanword argument as described by Mallory in regards to Uralic, but in this case with Kartvelian and Semitic languages. However, these loanwords can be attributed to trade and/or passing between the three, Semitic, Kartvelian and PIE, via unknown intermediary languages, and in either case do not share as strong a relationship with PIE as Uralic does. Another argument made by academics such as Tamas Gamkaralidze and Vyacheslav Ivanov was that of the glottalic theory, that PIE phonology was similar to that of the Kartvelian and Semitic languages and shared some aerial features. This theory has still failed to convince many Indo-European linguists. A 2022 paper by Lazaridis et al., titled The Genetic History of the Southern Arc, a bridge between West Asia and Europe, hypothesized that all ancient Indo-European speakers can be traced back to the Yamnaya culture, whose southward expansions into the southern arc left a trace in the DNA of the Bronze Age people of the region. However, the link connecting the PIE-speaking Yamnaya with the speakers of Anatolian languages was in the highlands of West Asia, the ancestral region shared by both. They therefore argued that the Proto-Indo-Anatolian homeland, or archaic PIE, lies south of the Caucasus, with the migration routes on the map described as follows. Two streams of northward migration brought Caucasus and Anatolian Levantine ancestry, and the Yamnaya of the steppes moved southwest into the Balkans, as well as southeast to the Caucasus and into Armenia, leaving patrilineal descendants. Anatolia experienced gene flow between West Asia, that is Caucasus, Anatolian and Levantine ancestry, with little to no gene flow from the Yamnaya. This is in contrast to every other region of Indo-European speakers, which the Southern Arc proponents used to suggest that the Proto-Indo-Anatolian homeland was in West Asia, with non-Anatolian Indo-European languages only arriving in the steppe later. Although not entirely contradictory, the main place of conflict with the steppe theory is the origin of Anatolian. Anthony traced Anatolian's origin to the steppe via a western migration through southeast Europe. The Southern Arc theory, however, posited that Anatolian cannot be linked to the steppe due to the lack of eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry in Anatolia. Following from this is their assertion that the population who therefore brought Proto-Indo-Anatolian and ultimately Proto-Indo-European were not eastern hunter-gatherers, but Caucasus hunter-gatherers. The Southern Arc theory has been received much better than the Hegarty et al. Paper. Anthony, in a 2024 paper, retained his position that archaic PIE, that is, before the Anatolian split, evolved in the steppes, but conceded that it is unclear how Indo-European languages arrived in Anatolia, and is therefore not closed to the possibility of an archaic PIE-PIA homeland in the Caucasus. Responding to the lack of eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry in Anatolia, Anthony suggested that the steppe ancestry in descendants of steppe cultures, like the Suvarovo, could have been diluted to ultimately being lost through extensive admixture with locals before they arrived into Anatolia via the Balkans, therefore accounting for this discrepancy. Other arguments made by some are that Indo-European migration to Anatolia could come under the elite recruitment model, which does not necessitate language shifts to be accompanied by genetic changes, another being that steppe ancestry has not been found in Anatolia yet, and that we need a lot more sampling to find conclusive answers. Hegarty et al.'s 2023 paper, Language Trees with Sampled Ancestors Support a Hybrid Model for the Origin of Indo-European Languages, is similar in many ways to the Southern Arc theory, albeit with very different dating. The authors posited that recent ancient DNA, or aDNA, evidence suggests that the Anatolian branch originates to the south of the Caucasus rather than the steppe, and that the dating for Indo-European expansions under the steppe model are too late. They believed that some Indo-European branches did in fact diverge from the steppe, but that they ultimately still came from a northern migration from south of the Caucasus, with the steppe only possibly constituting a secondary homeland for these branches. These branches include Germanic, Italic, Celtic, and Balto-Slavic, which are associated with corded-ware expansions that received a heavy influx of steppe DNA. The substantially lower amount of this steppe ancestry in Greece, the Balkans, and Anatolia is used by Hegarty et al. To argue that the steppe hypothesis cannot explain the origin and expansions of branches like Greek, Albanian, Armenian, Anatolian, and even likely Indo-Iranian, which are said to have split off much earlier than the former steppe-associated branches. Their hypothesis is ultimately a hybrid of both the steppe theory and the farming or agriculture spread theory. In terms of time, this paper dated PIE back to around 8,120 years before present, or 6,170 BCE, around 1,500 to 2,000 years earlier than the dating of the steppe theory. It also stated that branches had already started diverging from PIE at 7,000 years before present, or 5,050 BCE. Indo-Iranian was given a much earlier split-off date than under the steppe hypothesis. The paper also favoured a southern migration route for Indo-Iranian through West Asia, while acknowledging a potential northern route. There seems to be little linguistic evidence for this route, as well as not sufficiently explaining the high prevalence of the R1a paternal haplogroup in the subcontinent, which almost definitely came via the steppe. They, like the Southern Arc theory, argued that the ancestral component, or tracer dye, associated with the spread of Indo-European languages, was not from the eastern hunter-gatherers who carried R1b, the largest paternal haplogroup in the Yamnaya, but the Caucasus hunter-gatherers, who they mixed with, as well as rejecting Anthony's steppe origin for the Anatolian branch. Hegarty et al. Were critical of the use of linguistic paleontology and stated that words used to denote wheel, for example, could have had a different meaning at some point in time, therefore not constituting a strong enough method of dating PIE to a particular time or place. They also criticised the usage of PIE loanwords into Uralic as evidence of placing PIE in the steppe, as they believed loanwords from Caucasian and Semitic languages are earlier and therefore better suit an explanation of a more southern homeland. Cronin et al. Responded to the paper pointing to archaeological discrepancies between the dates of the study and some archaeologically datable technologies for which linguists can reconstruct vocabulary of entire semantic fields. They presented the following figure to colourfully articulate their criticism. They also addressed Hegarty et al.'s criticism of linguistic paleontology, stating that its validity is demonstrable due to its inspiring of the steppe model in the first place, which is well supported by archaeogenetic evidence and is integral to Hegarty et al.'s hybrid model. Kassian and Starostin criticised the genealogical tree offered in that some important nodes have very low probability and that it generally contradicted our understanding of the archaeolinguistics. Kassian and Starostin found Hegarty et al.'s criticism of linguistic paleontology highly undeserved and in places bordering on the irrational. They ridiculed Hegarty et al.'s argument that PIE words meaning wheel, axle, domestic horse, etc. in descendant languages could have simply meant something like general concept of rotation or cyclicality, axis or point of rotation in the night sky perceived around the pole star, and a kind of wild horse, despite these terms having very specific meanings in the descendant languages. They funnily added the following. It gets worse though. Most Indo-Europeanists agree that the reduplicated queklo, wheel, is a nominal derivative from the verbal root quel, to move. So, if anything, this original nominal stem did not so much refer to an idea of being round as it did to an object used to facilitate movement. And what other candidate than wheel could that particular object be? A 2024 paper titled The Genetic Origin of the Indo-Europeans, again by Lazaridis et al., revised the previous Southern Arc paper and pushed the Proto-Indo-Anatolian homeland north of the Caucasus now, including parts of the steppe. This paper studied ancient DNA from 299 new samples, demonstrating 3 previously unknown Eneolithic genetic clines. Caucasus Lower Volga cline, which was suffused with Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry and extended between a Caucasus Neolithic southern end in Neolithic Armenia and a steppe northern end in Berezhnovka in the Lower Volga. Volga cline, which formed as the Berezhnovka end of the cline, mixed with Volga HGs with high EHG ancestry, creating cultures like the Khvalinsk, which arguably eventually formed the Tocharian branch, through the tree of Khvalinsk, Repin, Afanasyevo, that is, Proto-Tocharians. Dnipro-Don cline, which formed as the Remontny middle of the cline, that is, with both Caucasus Neolithic and Lower Volga ancestry, mixed with Dnipro-Don hunter-gatherers to form the Seretny-Sti culture, direct ancestors of the Yamnaya. Caucasus Lower Volga peoples also had an impact further south in Armenia and Anatolia, mixing with Mesopotamian farmers, therefore providing a common link of ancestry between Anatolia and the steppe. The authors stated that since the common ancestral link between the Yamnaya and the Anatolians is from the Caucasus Lower Volga cline, and if we presume the early speakers of Proto-Indo-Anatolian shared some ancestry also, the Caucasus Lower Volga cline must be where this shared ancestry came from. They stated, therefore, that Proto-Indo-Anatolian and its descendants must have been spread by peoples with Caucasus Lower Volga cline ancestry post-4000 BCE. The authors admitted that the genetic data cannot speak to whether this shared Caucasus Lower Volga ancestry was spread with Proto-Indo-Anatolian languages from the Caucasus end of the cline northwards into the steppe, or vice versa, and cannot pinpoint who the speakers of Proto-Indo-Anatolian were. The paper favoured an eastern route from the North-Caucasus Lower Volga region into Anatolia. They reconciled this with the lack of evidence for Anatolian languages in eastern Anatolia by virtue of the Kuru-Araxes culture, non-Indo-European speaking, who could have forged a wedge between the Indo-Anatolian languages of the steppe in the north and those in West Asia, isolating them from each other and offering an explanation as to the recorded survival of Anatolian languages in only Western Anatolia. Anthony admitted he is even open to southwards migration via the sea, from Greece to Anatolia. Amidst all these theories, what seems to be almost certain is that a late stage of PIE was spoken in the steppes by the Yamnaya. What is unclear still is who exactly the earliest PIE, or Proto-Indo-Anatolian, speakers were, and where they lived, whether it be the steppe, south of the Caucasus or north of the Caucasus, the latter of which is bringing the southern arc full circle back to the steppes. David Anthony's much-awaited next book, currently titled Dogs of War, may be the next step to further unearthing the Proto-Indo-Europeans.